And here we finally get to the major crisis of the 19th century, perhaps the major crisis of American history, the Civil War. The map on the left shows you the two combatants, the geographical distribution of the two competing sides. The Union, or the United States government, in the north in blue, border states in sort of light blue, the original secession 7, the original seceding states, in dark gray, and the states that seceded later in light gray. On the right, you see a man named Marcus Spiegel, who joined hundreds of thousands when he volunteered to fight the Civil War in 1861. Born into a Jewish family in 1829 and having taken part in the failed German Revolution of 1848, he emigrated to Ohio, married a local farmer's daughter, and shared enthusiastically in American patriotism. When the war broke out, 150,000 Jews represented less than 1% of the U.S. population, but Spiegel told his brother-in-law that he went to war to defend, quote, the flag that was ever ready to protect you and me and everyone who sought its protection from oppression, end quote. He rose to the rank of colonel in the 120th Ohio Infantry, having seen action in Virginia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, about which he frequently wrote his wife, Caroline. What one Pennsylvania recruit called the magic word freedom shaped how many Union soldiers understood the conflict. But as the war progressed, pre-war understandings of liberty gave way to something new, as millions of Northerners who had not previously been abolitionists became convinced that preserving the Union for liberty required slavery's destruction. Marcus Spiegel's changing views mirrored the transformation of a struggle to save the Union into a war to end slavery. Though as an ardent Democrat, he shared the era's racist attitudes and thought Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation a mistake. But as the Union Army worked its way further into the Deep South, Spiegel became increasingly opposed to slavery. In January 1864, after witnessing slavery firsthand, he declared to his wife, quote, "Never hereafter will I either speak or vote in favor of slavery," end quote. He was killed in May 1864, one of the hundreds of thousands of Americans to perish in the Civil War. And now on to the rest of the lecture, narrated by Dana Flowers.
The subtopics for this lecture are the First Modern War, the Coming of Emancipation, the Second American Revolution, the Confederate Nation, Turning Points, and Rehearsals for Reconstruction and the End of the War. Departure of the 7th Regiment, a lithograph from 1861 illustrating the departure of a unit from the New York State Militia for service in the Civil War. A contemporary writer captured the exuberant spirit of the early days of the war. New York was certainly raving mad with excitement. The ladies laughed, smiled, sighed, sobbed, and wept. The men cheered and shouted as never men cheered and shouted before. The American Civil War has been called the First Modern War. This was the first time mass armies fought with weapons forged by the Industrial Revolution, and the scale of casualties was unprecedented in American history. The war became a conflict between societies as the distinction between military and civilian targets diminished. Wars like this depend on the effectiveness of political leaders, the capacity to mobilize economic resources, and a society's determination to continue the war despite failures. The Union seemed favored over the Confederacy. The North, including loyal border states, had a population of 22 million, while the South had only 9 million, 3.5 million of whom were slaves. The Union had far more manufacturing, railroad track, and financial resources. Yet, to end the rebellion, the Union had to invade and conquer a huge area and defeat spirited Confederate soldiers defending homes and families. Even if the South lost most battles, it could win by exhausting the enemy. The outbreak of war stimulated powerful feelings of patriotism, and recruits hastened to enlist, thinking the war would be short and glorious. Both sides later resorted to a draft, the Confederacy in 1862, the Union the next year. By 1865, more than 2 million men had served in the Union Army, and 900,000 in the Confederate. Each army was a cross-section of its society. The Northern Army was composed of mostly farm boys, shopkeepers, artisans, and urban workers. And the Southern Army consisted mostly of non-slaveholding small farmers and slaveholding officers. Few soldiers had any military experience. Their notions of war were highly romanticized, and most were unprepared for military regimentation. The beginning of the war was mostly the chores of military encampment and mobilization, only occasionally interrupted by short bursts of intense fighting. Soldiers and officers did not anticipate how technological advances changed warfare. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which the railroad moved troops and supplies. The war saw the famous battle between the Union vessel Monitor and the Confederate Merrimac in 1862, which showed the advantage of ironclads over wooden ships and transformed naval warfare. The telegraph, observation balloons, and even hand grenades and submarines were used for the first time. Most important was the revolution in arms manufacturing, which replaced the musket, accurate only at a short range, with the rifle, deadly at 600 or more yards because of its grooved barrel. This changed the nature of combat, making heavy fortifications and trenches far more important and giving defensive forces, usually Confederates, a significant advantage. This development produced the awful casualties of the war's battles. Medical care was primitive, and for the first time, large numbers of Americans were captured and held as prisoners of war in camps, leading to high death rates. At least 750,000 died in the war, the equivalent of more than 7 million in today's population, and more than the entire number of Americans killed in all other wars in U.S. history, from the Revolution to the Iraq War. War was becoming more destructive worldwide, and though the scale of the Civil War was unique in American history, the 19th century saw frequent destruction of its magnitude, such as in the Taiping Rebellion, 23 million deaths, and the War of Triple Alliance in South America, half of Paraguay's pre-war population of 525,000 dead. By the time secession ran its course, 11 slave states had left the Union. Sergeant James W. Travis, 38th Illinois Infantry, Union Army, and Private Edwin Francis Jemison, 2nd Louisiana Regiment, Confederate Army, two of the nearly 3 million Americans who fought in the Civil War. Before going off to war, many soldiers sat for photographs like these, reproduced on small cards called carta de visite, which they distributed to friends and loved ones. Jemison was killed in the Battle of Malvern Hill in July 1862. The Civil War was also modern in the use of propaganda by both sides to mobilize public opinion. In the North, patriotic organizations and the War Department reaffirmed Northern values, portrayed the Democratic Party as treasonous, and accused the South of crimes against Union soldiers and loyal civilians. The South engaged in similar campaigns. Modern media, with newspapers, telegraphs, and especially photographs, for the first time captured the often shocking reality of war and communicated it to the public. Both sides were unprepared for war. There was no national banking system, no tax system to raise revenue for the war, and few accurate maps of the South. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln enacted a blockade of the South, intended to destroy its commerce, but the Navy at first had too few ships to enforce it. The problems of purchasing and distributing food, weapons, and other supplies for the armies were huge. While the Union Army eventually became the best-fed and best-supplied force in history, Southern soldiers lacked food, uniforms, and shoes. Lacking sufficient industrial capacity, the Confederate government imported many items for the military from abroad and established its own arsenals. This table shows that, in nearly every resource for warfare, the Union enjoyed a distinct advantage, but this did not make Union victories inevitable. As during the War of Independence, the stronger side sometimes loses. War Spirit at Home, an 1866 painting by the New Jersey artist Lily M. Spencer, depicts a family reading the news of the Union capture of Vicksburg in 1863. The household is now composed of women and children. The husband may be off in the army. While the children play as soldiers, the cross in the folds of the newspaper suggests a less celebratory reflection on the conflict. Newspapers brought news of the war into American homes. Each side tried to exploit its advantages. The South by adopting a defensive strategy to wear down the North, led by the brilliant Robert E. Lee, and the North by using its superiority in manpower and technology. But the Northern Army was at first small, its officers and leadership were poor, and it was focused on capturing Richmond, the Confederacy's capital, a difficult task. Lincoln soon realized that capturing and occupying territory would not win the war. Defeating the South's armies would. Lincoln's eventual embrace of emancipation acknowledged that slavery was the basis of the Confederacy, and that to win the conflict, the Union had to make this institution, the economic and social foundation of the South, a military target. Most of the war in the East occurred in a narrow corridor between Washington and Richmond, as a series of Union generals led the North's Army of the Potomac toward the Confederate capital, only to be repeatedly repulsed by the main Confederate Army. The First Battle of Bull Run ended in the defeat and chaotic retreat of Union forces. This battle ended the widespread belief that the war would end quickly. George B. McClellan soon took command of the Union's main army, but after thoroughly training this army's tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers, he proved reluctant to commit them to battle. McClellan was a Democrat, and he hoped that compromise might end the conflict without many casualties or weakening slavery. Months of military inactivity followed. An 8-inch cannon, one of the weapons forged in the Industrial Revolution and deployed in the Civil War. This is a surgeon's kit used in the Civil War, containing amputation instruments, knives, and tourniquets. With medical knowledge and practices primitive at best, far more men died from wounds, infections, and disease than in battle. In the spring of 1862, George B. McClellan, pressured by public opinion, President Lincoln, and Congress, led the Army of the Potomac, more than 100,000 men, into Virginia. Approaching the Confederate capital on the peninsula southwest of Richmond, McClellan's advance was ably deflected by Lee in a series of battles, forcing McClellan back to Washington, D.C. After Lee won the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, he invaded the North, hoping to bring border slave states into the Confederacy, gain French and British recognition of Southern independence, influence the North's elections in the fall, and perhaps capture Washington. At the Battle of Antietam, McClellan and his army repelled Lee's invasion. In one day at Antietam, nearly 4,000 men were killed and 18,000 wounded. More Americans died in this battle on September 17, 1862, than on any other day in American history, including Pearl Harbor and D-Day in World War II, and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The Northern triumph was short-lived. General Ambrose E. Burnside, who replaced McClellan, was repulsed by Lee's army at Fredericksburg, Virginia in December 1862 with heavy losses. The North had better luck in the West. There, Ulysses S. Grant, a West Point graduate whose Army career had been ruined by his excessive drinking, captured several important forts in Tennessee in early 1862. In April 1862, naval forces under Admiral David G. Farragut steamed into New Orleans and captured that city for the Union, which now controlled the South's largest city and its lucrative nearby sugar plantations. After Grant repelled a surprise Confederate attack at Shiloh, Tennessee, Union success in the West stalled. This is an image of Union General George B. McClellan drilling his troops during the winter of 1861 through 1862. It's a painting by an unknown artist. During the first 2 years of the war, most of the fighting took place in Virginia and Maryland. The Civil War had revolutionary effects on American society, the most important of which was the destruction of slavery, the fundamental institution of Southern society. The emancipation of America's 4 million slaves, in numbers, scale, and economic value, was far greater than any other emancipation of slaves or serfs in Russia in the world. At the war's beginning, Lincoln identified the North's cause with the cause of free labor. But Lincoln also initially stated that the conflict was not being fought to end or limit slavery, but to preserve the Union. He wanted to keep the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri in the Union, and build the broadest possible base of support for the war in the North. As Confederates used slave labor for military purposes and blacks began to escape to Union lines, this initial policy of ignoring slavery became untenable. By the end of 1861, Union commanders had begun treating escaped slaves as contraband of war, property of military value subject to confiscation. Southern blacks themselves took actions that propelled the Union toward ending slavery. Well before Lincoln's Emancipation Act, slaves saw the war as an opportunity to gain their freedom. Thousands escaped to the safety of Union lines, crippling many plantations. In areas occupied by Northern soldiers, slaves refused to work unless paid. This is Thoughts of Liberia, Emancipation, an enigmatic painting by the artist Edwin White from 1861, and depicts a black man sitting before the hearth of a modest cabin, holding a cane and a newspaper. On the wall is a poster, Haiti. The man is evidently thinking of emigrating to Liberia, the outpost in Africa established years earlier by the American Colonization Society, or perhaps to Haiti. The painting has been interpreted as a reassuring message to whites who feared that abolition would produce a large class of free blacks, suggesting instead that emancipated slaves wanted to leave the United States. But the reference to Haiti also reminds us of the revolution that overthrew slavery there. Most of the Union's victories in the first 2 years of the war occurred in the West, especially at Shiloh and New Orleans. This is Fortress Monroe, Virginia, a Union installation near Norfolk, where the process of emancipation began early in the Civil War when General Benjamin F. Butler refused to return runaway slaves to their owners. This Civil War photograph depicts African-American men, women, and children who escaped to Union lines in a mule-drawn covered wagon. The actions of fugitives like these helped propel the nation down the road to emancipation. Anti-slavery Northerners pressed the federal government to realize that slavery was the basis of the Southern economy and its military capacities, and they insisted that emancipation was required in order to weaken the South. Abolitionists and radical Republicans demanded, none more adamantly than Frederick Douglass, that abolition become a war aim. Congress, frustrated by military failures, prohibited the Army from returning fugitive slaves, abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and the territories, and passed the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves of disloyal owners in Union-occupied territory and slaves who escaped to Union lines. But Lincoln reversed the policies of Union generals who declared emancipation in their districts, and he still endorsed colonization as a solution to slavery. In summer 1862, Lincoln decided that emancipation had become a military and political necessity. He delayed his intention to free the slaves until after a Union victory, and after the Battle of Antietam, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Democrats in the North used the declaration to gain votes, arguing that Republicans threatened to inundate the North with cheap black labor and allow blacks to marry white women. The Democrats gained considerable political victories in some northern states, and Lincoln, now on the defensive, revived plans for gradual emancipation and colonization and downplayed racial equality. Abe Lincoln's Last Card, an engraving from the British magazine Punch, October 18, 1862, portrays the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation as the last move of a desperate gambler. With the exception of a few areas, the Emancipation Proclamation applied only to slaves in parts of the Confederacy, not under Union control, on January 1, 1863. Lincoln did not free the slaves with a stroke of his pen, but the proclamation did change the nature of the Civil War. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document did not free all the slaves, and at first applied to very few. Based on Lincoln's authority as military commander-in-chief, the proclamation exempted areas under Union control. It thus did not apply to loyal border slave states that had not seceded, or to parts of the Confederacy occupied by Union forces, such as Tennessee and parts of Virginia and Louisiana. But it declared free the vast majority of the South's slaves, more than 3 million men, women, and children. Still, behind Confederate lines, these slaves would be free only when Union military success made them so. The Emancipation Proclamation made the Union Army an agent of freedom and promised the death of slavery by combining the goals of abolition and preserving the Union. It altered the nature of the Civil War and the course of American history. It also represented a change in Lincoln's thinking. Lincoln did not mention compensating slaveholders for the loss of their slaves, nor did he mention colonization. The order committed the North to enlisting black soldiers in the Union Army. Emancipation in the United States, unlike elsewhere, was immediate and offered no compensation. The Civil War, begun to preserve the nation, now promised a revolutionary transformation of Southern life and a redefinition of American freedom. Without colonization, emancipation meant incorporating freed slaves into American life. A new system of labor, politics, and race relations would have to replace slavery. This is Freed Negroes Celebrating President Lincoln's Decree of Emancipation, a fanciful engraving from the French periodical Le Monde Illustré, March 21, 1863. The proclamation's provision allowing blacks to enlist in the Army had far-reaching effects. Although the Navy allowed blacks to serve as sailors, they had been excluded from the Army. Lincoln's administration first refused to allow blacks to enlist, fearing that it would alienate white soldiers and border slave states that stayed in the Union. But a few Union commanders enlisted soldiers who were contraband, as happened in South Carolina. Only with the Emancipation Proclamation did significant black enlistment begin. By the end of the war, 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army and 24,000 in the Union Navy. 1/3 died in battle from wounds or disease. Black soldiers and units received considerable notoriety after showing great heroism in battle, such as the 54th Massachusetts and its assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, in 1863, popularized in the film Glory. Most black soldiers were emancipated slaves who joined the Army in the South. Many were slaves from loyal border states who excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation, where enlistment was, for the most part, the only road to freedom. Here, black military service undermined slavery because Congress expanded the proclamation to liberate the families of black soldiers as well. Military service was liberating for many black soldiers who earned a new sense of dignity and rights. As veterans, many of these troops became community and political leaders, including many of the Reconstruction era. Within the Army, however, black troops received discriminatory treatment, including being led only by white officers, being more often assigned to work rather than combat duty, and at first receiving unequal pay. They were targeted by Confederates who executed some black prisoners. But black soldiers' service ensured that they could make claims on the government for equal rights and citizenship in the war's aftermath. This is the regimental banner and motto of a unit of African American soldiers and embodies the hope that service in the Union Army will lead to citizenship in the post-war world. This widely reprinted recruiting poster urged African American men to join the Union Army after Congress and the President changed the policy of allowing only whites to serve. This is a photograph of a black washerwoman for the Union Army. Wearing a small American flag reflects how the war and emancipation led African Americans to identify strongly with the nation. This is the only known photograph of a black Union soldier with his family. This is a songbook compiled and illustrated by a Union soldier and includes John Brown's Body, sung to the melody of a Methodist hymn. Because it radically transformed American government and society, some historians called the American Civil War the Second American Revolution. Notions of freedom were contested and transformed by the war. Union victory secured the North's understanding of freedom as self-ownership and owning one's own labor, as opposed to the South's vision of freedom as mastership over others. The war advanced abolitionist definitions of freedom, and Lincoln's emancipation of the slaves reinforced Americans' sense that their nation was a progressive force in world history. Lincoln did the most to link the war with Northern values. The American Civil War was part of a worldwide phenomenon of nation building. Throughout the world, powerful, centralized nation-states developed in old countries and new nations emerged where none had ever existed. Modern states consolidated their power and reduced local autonomy. Japan and Argentina are two examples where this occurred, and where rapid economic development quickly followed national unification. Lincoln has even been called the American Mazzini or Bismarck, figures who created nation-states in Italy and Germany, respectively. But Lincoln's America, unlike these nations, was based on universal ideas of political democracy, human liberty, and self-government. Other nations were based on particular identities of ethnicity, culture, and language. In November 1863, in his Gettysburg Address, commemorating the battle's dead, Lincoln reaffirmed that all men are created equal, and stated the war heralded a new birth of freedom. The war forged a new self-consciousness, reflected in the increased usage of the word nation instead of union. Lincoln used union 20 times in his inaugural address, and nation did not appear, whereas the Gettysburg Address contained no mention of the Union, but the word nation was used 5 times. The illustration accompanying the American flag, a piece of patriotic Civil War sheet music, exemplifies how the war united the ideals of liberty and nationhood. This illustrates Lincoln and the Female Slave by the free black artist David B. Bowser. Working in Philadelphia, Bowser painted flags for a number of black Civil War regiments. Lincoln confers freedom on a kneeling slave, an image that downplays blacks' role in their own emancipation. This is The Eagle's Nest, an 1861 anti-secession cartoon promising annihilation to traitors. The eggs representing seceding states have become rotten and are hatching monsters. The war changed religion. Northern Protestant clergy tried to give the war a religious justification and sanctify the sacrifices of Northern soldiers. In their sermons, they joined Christianity and patriotism into a civic religion, marking the war as God's means of eradicating slavery and truly making America a land of liberty. Confederates were equally convinced that their cause was the Christian cause. Religion also enabled Americans to cope with the horrors of the battlefield and the enormous loss of life caused by the conflict. Coping with death also required massive government involvement, notifying next of kin and accounting for dead and missing soldiers. After the war ended, the federal government launched a campaign during the Reconstruction to reinter Union war casualties in national military cemeteries. Intensified Northern nationalism made criticism of the war or Lincoln's administration seem treasonous to Republicans. Thousands of opposition newspaper editors, Democratic politicians, opponents of enlistment and the draft, and ordinary civilians were arrested, often arbitrarily. As the Constitution did not clarify who had the authority to suspend habeas corpus, Lincoln claimed this right under his presidential war powers, and he suspended it twice for those charged with disloyal activities. The courts generally gave the administration a free hand, and Lincoln even ignored Supreme Court decisions in individual cases. Only in 1866 did the Supreme Court declare it unconstitutional to bring accused persons before military tribunals, where civil courts were in operation. While Lincoln was no dictator, the conflict showed that civil liberties were fragile in wartime. The Sisters of Charity, an order of nuns, photographed with doctors and soldiers at a hospital in Philadelphia in 1863. Many of the wounded from the Battle of Gettysburg were sent here for treatment. The Catholic contribution to the Union war effort mitigated the nativist bias, so prominent in the 1850s. This is an image of a girl in a morning dress. She holds a framed photograph of her father, a cavalryman. The Northern War effort empowered both the federal government and a rising class of capitalist businessmen. Unlike the South, which was economically devastated, the Northern economy flourished. Industrial profits soared from wartime inflation and government contracts to produce supplies, coal, and iron. Mechanization was spurred onward by war demands in boot and shoe production and meat packing. Agricultural production also expanded during the war. The Northern government was committed to rapid economic growth and development, and Congress adopted policies that promoted this and transformed America's financial system. The Homestead Act spurred agricultural development by offering 160 acres of free public land to settlers in the West. The Land Grant College Act helped states establish agricultural and mechanical schools. Congress also made huge grants of money and land for internal improvements, including up to 100 million acres to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific to build the Transcontinental Railroad. This monumental project required 20,000 men to lay track, an enterprise that involved many Chinese contract laborers, called coolies by Americans. Hundreds of these workers would perish during the construction of the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad, finished in 1869, expanded the national market, facilitated Western settlement and investment, and sealed the fate of Indians in the West. This is sheet music for two of the best-known patriotic songs written during the Civil War. Because Lincoln removed soldiers from the West to fight in the East, soldiers could not keep white settlers from intruding on Indian territories. Conflict between whites and federal troops and the Indians increased. Sioux attacks on white farmers in Minnesota led to the sentencing and mass hanging of 38 Indians, the largest official execution in American history. In 1864, Colorado soldiers killed around 400 Arapaho and Cheyenne men, women, and children at Sand Creek. The Union Army also launched a campaign against the Navajo in the Southwest and forced them onto a reservation. The Confederacy ironically treated Indians more fairly than the Union, allowing tribes to elect representatives to its Congress and allowing Indian tribes on reservations complete self-government. Some tribes, like the Cherokee, sided with the Confederacy, and after the war, they were forced to cede land to the federal government, accept former slaves into the Cherokee Nation, and provide them with land. The status of these groups remains controversial today, such as the recent amendment to the Cherokee Constitution, excluding descendants of former slaves from citizenship, which led to lawsuits still pending. This photograph from 1861 depicts Native American volunteer soldiers being enrolled in the Union Army. Indian soldiers were recruited well before the Army admitted blacks. This is a lithograph depicting the hanging of 38 Sioux Dakotas at Mankato, Minnesota, in December 1862, the largest mass execution in American history. Here, a Union soldier stands guard over a group of Indians during the Navajos' Long Walk, in which the Army removed them from their New Mexico homeland to a reservation hundreds of miles away. This map shows Civil War battles in the Western Territories. The need to generate revenue to pay for the war transformed America's financial system. To raise funds, the government increased the tariff to record levels, imposed new taxes on production and consumption, and passed the first income tax in American history. The Union government also borrowed more than $2 billion by selling interest-bearing bonds, creating a huge national debt. It also printed more than $400 million of paper money, called greenbacks, as legal tender. Congress rationalized banking by creating a system of nationally chartered banks required to buy government bonds and allowed to issue banknotes as currency. A heavy tax drove money issued by state banks out of circulation. The United States, with a money supply before the war and an anarchic mix of paper notes issued by state and local banks, during the war had two kinds of national paper money: greenbacks printed by the federal government and notes issued by new national banks. Wartime economic policies handsomely benefited Northern manufacturers, railroad businessmen, and financiers. Many captains of industry of the Gilded Age made their fortunes in the war, including iron and steel entrepreneur Andrew Carnegie, the oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, the financiers Jay Gould and J.P. Morgan, and Philip D. Armour, who earned millions supplying beef to the Union Army. As a whole, Union economic policies vastly expanded the power and size of the federal government. The federal budget in 1865 was more than $1 billion, 20 times larger than 1860, and the federal government became the nation's largest employer. For many Northern women, the war created economic opportunity. Women took manufacturing jobs and jobs in male professions, such as nursing. Women found jobs as clerks in the expanding federal government. Women maintained a presence after the war in white-collar government jobs, retail sales, and nursing. Women worked as nurses in the armies, and hundreds of thousands of women indirectly supported the armies by raising money and supplies for soldiers and freed slaves. The U.S. Sanitary Commission became a centralized national relief agency to coordinate efforts on the home front. These activities brought women into the public sphere in new ways. The suffrage movement suspended its work during the conflict, but women's contribution to the war effort heightened the sense of many women that they deserved the vote in its aftermath. After the war, Clara Barton and many others continued the suffrage movement. Filling cartridges at the U.S. Arsenal of Watertown, Massachusetts, an engraving from Harper's Weekly, September 21, 1861. Both men and women were drawn to work in the booming war-related industries of the North. This is an image of wounded soldiers at Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C., shortly after the end of the Civil War. Whimsical potholders expressing hope for a better life for emancipated slaves were sold at the Chicago Sanitary Fair of 1865 to raise money for Soldiers' Aid. The war and Lincoln's policies divided the North. Republicans called those opposing the war copperheads after a poisonous snake that strikes without warning. Increasing casualties and rapid social change caused internal conflict. States with a large Southern-born population, like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and cities with large working-class Catholic immigrant populations were at the center of disquiet. The growing power of the federal government challenged local autonomy, most notably in the draft law, which allowed individuals to provide a substitute or pay a fee to escape service. Wage earners resented the huge profits of manufacturers and financiers while inflation eroded their pay. The war saw the rebirth of the Northern labor movement, which called many strikes. Prospective changes in the status of blacks sparked a racist backlash in much of the North. Although divided between anti-war and pro-war wings, the Democratic Party criticized Lincoln's policies and the draft. Occasionally, dissent degenerated into violence, most notably the July 1863 riots against the draft in New York City, in which a mostly Irish immigrant mob attacked draft offices, the mansions of wealthy Republicans, industrial establishments, and city blacks. More than 100 people were killed before federal troops ended the tumult. This is an image of children at the Colored Orphan Asylum in New York City, photographed in 1862. This is an image of the burning of the Colored Orphan Asylum during the New York City draft riots of 1863. The children were evacuated before the mob destroyed the building. The riots in New York, the mob lynching a Negro in Clarkson Street, an engraving from the British magazine Illustrated London News, August 8, 1863, reveals how the New York City draft riots escalated from an attempt to obstruct the draft into an assault on the city's black population. Jefferson Davis proved unable to rally the Southern public behind the war. Although eloquent, Davis, a West Point graduate, senator, and Mississippi plantation owner, lacked charisma and an ability to connect with ordinary citizens. The Confederacy's lack of a party system also was a liability, as Southern leaders saw parties as a danger to national unity. Davis thus lacked a counterpart to the well-organized Republican Party, which organized support for Lincoln's administration. Under Davis, the South's government became very centralized, raising armies, taking control of railroads, and building factories. But the Confederate government never effectively utilized the South's main economic resource, cotton. A strategy to focus on food production as a means to compel Great Britain, whose mills used Southern cotton, to side with the Confederacy failed. Other nations increased their cotton production, such as Egypt and India, which helped produce a crisis of overproduction after the war when Southern cotton production resumed. Nor did Davis deal effectively with obstructionist governors like Joseph E. Brown of Georgia, who opposed the draft as an infringement of states' rights. Social change and internal strife consumed the South as the war dragged on. Initially, white Southerners widely supported the Confederate cause and war effort, claiming the war was being fought to protect liberty against Northern tyranny. Yet, public disaffection grew, especially over the draft, which allowed substitutes and exempted one white male for every 20 slaves on a plantation, thus releasing from service many overseers and planters' sons, and greatly increasing opposition to the war among poor whites. Economic crisis also caused inner turmoil in the South. As the blockade became more effective, more of the South became occupied by Union forces and slave productivity declined. Shortages of essential goods became widespread. Confederate policies that seemed to favor the wealthy and large slave owners exacerbated the effects of economic troubles, as poor whites felt they faced unequal burdens. While the Confederacy, like the North, borrowed heavily to finance the war, the planter-dominated Congress would not levy heavy taxes that planters would have to pay. Instead, it printed an enormous amount of paper money, even more than the greenbacks printed by the North. Congress authorized military officers to seize goods and pay citizens with this money, which became increasingly worthless. Many Southerners resented this practice. In some cities, food riots broke out. By the end of the war, nearly 100,000 men, mostly poor non-slaveholders, had deserted from the Confederate Army. The centrality of slavery to the Confederacy is illustrated by the paper money issued by state governments and private banks, which frequently juxtaposed scenes of slaves at work with other revered images. The $10 note of the Eastern Bank of Alabama depicts slaves working in the field and at a port, along with an idealized portrait of Southern white womanhood. Alabama's $5 bill includes an overseer directing slaves in the field and a symbol of liberty. This is a drawing by Langdon Cheves III, the teenage grandson of a prominent South Carolina political leader. It depicts a Confederate killing a Yankee officer. By 1864, organized movements calling for peace surfaced in several Southern states, and secret societies were actively promoting disloyalty. Confederate military tribunals imprisoned Unionists, drove them from their homes, and executed a few. By the end of the war, about 50,000 white Southerners fought for the Union. One of the most celebrated Union heroes of the war was Elizabeth Van Lew of Richmond, who convinced her family to free their slaves in 1843, helped to supply Union prisoners of war, and assisted some in escape. A former slave of the Van Lew family, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, obtained information as a servant in the Southern White House, which Van Lew then passed to Union forces. More than in the North, the war imposed many costs on women in the South. Often left alone on farms and plantations, women had to take over men's responsibilities to conduct business and discipline slaves. Southern women organized to support soldiers and engaged in previously male occupations. Government girls worked as clerks in the Confederate government. Many, in the absence of slave labor or their husbands, found it increasingly difficult to feed their families, petitioned the government for assistance, not as charity, but as a right, and forced state governments to begin distributing supplies to needy families. While Southern women's contribution to the war was legendary, more women came to believe that the war was not worth the sacrifices they were making. Women's disaffection helped decrease civilian morale and foster desertion from the army. Increasing shortages of white manpower led the Confederate government to authorize the arming of slaves to fight on the South's behalf, an event no one could have foreseen at the start of the war. Many slaveholders resisted it, and the Confederate Senate rejected it. The Confederate Congress approved the measure only in March 1865, when Robert E. Lee endorsed it. The war ended before substantial enlistment began, but Confederate forces did employ blacks, mostly slaves, as laborers. The South's decision to raise black troops illustrates how the war undermined not only slavery, but also the pro-slavery ideology. Howell Cobb of Georgia stated, "If slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." This is an engraving in the New York Illustrated News and depicts the bread riot that took place in Mobile, Alabama in the fall of 1863. Painted in 1864 by the Virginia artist William D. Washington, the burial of Latane depicts a common wartime scene. The deceased is Confederate cavalry officer William Latane. The work illustrates how women, children, and slaves predominated on the Southern home front. Having finished digging the grave, the slave on the left has a faraway look in his eyes. Perhaps he is listening for the sound of the approaching Union Army. The painting was displayed in Richmond accompanied by a bucket into which viewers were urged to deposit contributions to the Southern cause. In July 1863, the Union won major victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Despite the apparent disintegration of slavery and eroding Southern morale, the war's outcome was uncertain in 1863 and 1864. In April 1863, Fighting Joe Hooker, a new Union commander in the East, invaded central Virginia. Outnumbered 2-1, Lee repelled Hooker at Chancellorsville, though his most talented commander, Stonewall Jackson, was mortally wounded in the fight. Lee soon decided on another invasion of the North, although the rationale for it remains unknown. His army met and fought Union forces under General George G. Meade at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the first 3 days of July. Gettysburg was the largest battle ever in North America. 165,000 troops fought there. A desperate frontal assault led by Major General George E. Pickett failed to break Union lines on July 3rd, and Lee, having regretted ordering Pickett's charge, retreated. The high tide of the Confederacy had been reached, and Lee's soldiers never again set foot on Northern soil. Simultaneously, Union forces led by Ulysses S. Grant had laid siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. On July 4th, Confederate forces surrendered, and the entire Mississippi River fell to Union forces. Gettysburg and Vicksburg greatly diminished Southern hopes for victory. Given the command of Union forces in the East, Grant, in 1864, initiated a war of attrition against Lee's army in Virginia. Grant was willing to incur high numbers of casualties with the knowledge that the North could replenish its armies, while the South could not. In May 1864, Grant's Army of the Potomac began a month of fierce fighting and campaigning. In the Battle of the Wilderness, both sides suffered great casualties, but instead of retreating, as had previous Union commanders, Grant pushed on, fighting Lee again at Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. After 6 weeks, Grant lost 60,000 men, an enormous number, but he inflicted 30,000 casualties on Lee's army. This sustained fighting was a turning point in modern warfare and more resembled the modern trench warfare of World War I than the methods of 1861. Although Grant maintained the initiative, his strategy led to criticisms that he was a butcher. Victory was elusive. When Grant failed to capture Petersburg, a city that controlled the railways into Richmond, he laid siege to the city. At the same time, General William T. Sherman marched through Georgia and took Atlanta in September 1864. With casualties skyrocketing in the spring and summer of 1864, Northern morale sank to its lowest point in the war. Lincoln believed he would lose the presidential election in the fall. Radical Republicans nominated an alternative candidate, John C. Fremont, on a radical plank, and General George B. McClellan, the Democratic candidate, called for a peace conference with the Confederacy. Ultimately, Lincoln secured the Republican nomination and, with Sherman's capture of Atlanta, won a sweeping victory. Lincoln's re-election guaranteed that the war would continue until the Confederacy had been crushed. These are images of Generals Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, leaders of the opposing armies in the East from 1864 through 1865. General Grant's Council of War, an unusual candid photograph taken in Virginia in 1864 from the upper floor of a nearby church, shows Grant leaning over the shoulder of General George C. Meade to examine a map. Other generals and staff sit on pews removed from the church. This is an image of Confederate dead at Spotsylvania, Virginia, the site of a bloody battle in 1864. Adolf Metzner, a German pharmacist who immigrated to the United States in 1856 and served in an Indiana regiment during the Civil War, made many sketches of his experiences. This watercolor depicts Union soldiers embarking on General William T. Sherman's Atlanta campaign in May of 1864. A political cartoon from 1864 suggests the difficulty faced by the Democratic candidate, George B. McClellan, in reconciling the party's war and peace wings. Federal authorities came to supervise the transition from slavery to freedom as the war came to an end and more Southern territory came under Union control. Conflict over access to land, control over labor, and new structures of political power took place in South Carolina, Louisiana, and other parts of the South. The best known of these, rehearsals for Reconstruction, was the experiment on the Sea Islands off the South Carolina coast. In 1861, the Union Navy occupied the islands and whites fled, leaving 10,000 slaves. Northern Army officers, cotton plantation investors, and black and white reformers came to reconstruct the island and lift up the island's blacks. Northern-born teachers believed education would make the former slaves independent and productive citizens, and started schools. Although the slaves' most basic demand was for land to farm themselves, some Northerners believed free labor for slaves should take the form of wage work, which was more humane than slave labor. When the land was sold by the federal government, it went mostly to Northern investors who wanted to show the advantages of free labor and make a profit. By 1865, Sea Island black families were working for wages, gaining an education, and enjoying a better material life than under slavery. A very different experiment took place in Louisiana and Mississippi River Valley. After Vicksburg, Union authorities tried to resurrect the cotton plantations with wage labor, but they forced the former slaves to sign labor contracts with former plantation owners. Unlike before the war, laborers would be paid wages, provided with education, free from physical punishment, and their families were safe from the disruption of sale. Neither side was satisfied with the new system, with blacks resenting labor contracts and the continuation of working for whites, and planters complaining of insubordinate workers. Only occasionally did Army officers seek to implement a different version of freedom, such as Grant at Davis Bend, Mississippi. Rather than being forced into contracts at Davis Bend, land was divided among emancipated slaves, and a system of government was established allowing former slaves to elect their own judges and sheriffs. The future political status of African Americans became a central point of debate as the war continued, and events in Union-occupied Louisiana focused the nation on the question. Lincoln, hoping to establish a civilian government in that state, announced a 10% plan of Reconstruction. This offered amnesty and full restoration of rights, including property, except for slaves, to almost all white Southerners who swore loyalty to the Union and support for emancipation. When 10% of the voters of 1860 took the oath, they could elect a new state government, which would have to abolish slavery. Lincoln's plan offered no role for freed blacks, but he hoped that his plan would appeal to white Southerners and hasten the war's end. Free blacks in New Orleans, however, used the Union occupation to push for civil, legal, and political equality, and they found sympathy among radical Republicans in Congress who, in 1864, passed the Wade-Davis Bill. This bill required a majority, not just 1/10, of white male Southerners to pledge loyalty to the Union before Reconstruction could begin in any state. And it gave blacks legal equality, although not the vote. Lincoln vetoed the bill, and as the war came to a close, no plan for Reconstruction existed to follow its end. This diagram of plots selected by former slaves on Port Royal Island in South Carolina on January 25, 1864, shows taking advantage of a sale of abandoned property. 18 blacks, 17 men, and 1 woman selected plots on a Sea Island plantation for purchase. This is a school for freed people established in 1862 on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, by an aid association in Pennsylvania. In November 1864, Sherman started a march to the sea from Atlanta to the Georgia coast. His forces destroyed railroads, buildings, and food and supplies to deny their use by Confederate troops. Sherman's vision of destroying civilian property and resources as a way to win the war was controversial, but very modern. Sherman continued his path of destruction into South Carolina, freeing slaves and ruining plantations. On January 31, 1865, Congress approved the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the entire Union. In his second inaugural address in March of 1865, Lincoln called for national reconciliation. On April 2nd, Grant finally pierced Lee's lines at Petersburg, causing Lee to retreat and abandon Richmond, which was occupied by Northern troops the next day. On April 4th, Lincoln, ignoring his own safety, walked Richmond's streets, accompanied by only a dozen sailors. Slaves celebrated and praised him everywhere he went. Lee and his army headed west, but were soon surrounded by Grant's army. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, bringing the Civil War to an end. Only 5 days later, before he could announce plans to reconstruct the South, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a celebrated actor, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His body was transported to Springfield by a winding railroad route that demonstrated how tightly bound by transportation and economy the northern states had become. Mourners lined the train route, and thousands viewed his body in state in major cities before he was laid to rest on May 4, 1865. This is a photograph of General William T. Sherman in 1864. The military defeat of the Confederacy came in the East with Sherman's march to the sea, Grant's occupation of Richmond, and the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army. This is an image of abandoned weapons and ruined buildings in Richmond shortly after the Union Army occupied the city in April of 1865. The war reverberated in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe. When Grant toured Europe in 1877, after retiring from the presidency, he was greeted as a hero. In England, nobles hailed him as a military genius. Workers there welcomed him as the general who saved the world's leading experiment in democracy on behalf of a president, Abraham Lincoln, who had vindicated free labor by emancipating the slaves. Otto von Bismarck, Germany's powerful chancellor, welcomed Grant as a nation builder. The Civil War truly did build the modern American nation, preserving the Union, destroying slavery, and shifting power in the nation from the South to the North and from slave-owning planters to Northern capitalists. It greatly expanded the power of the federal government and quickened the Northern economy's modernization. The war also made central the task of defining and protecting freedom for African Americans. But both sides had lost something they had fought the war to protect. The South fought to protect slavery, which had been destroyed, and the North, which had fought for the world of free labor, the small shop, and the independent farmer, had been transformed into an industrialized nation. A vision of freedom founded in free labor was the task confronting the post-war nation. Blacks who had achieved equality in death and struggle were now seeking that freedom in life, as Frederick Douglass proclaimed, "The work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins." A redesign of the American flag proposed in 1863 illustrates the linkage of nationalism and freedom that was solidified by the Civil War. The 35 stars forming the word "free" include the 11 Confederate states. Winslow Homer's painting, "The Veteran in a New Field," completed in the fall of 1865, offers a reflection on the Civil War and its legacy. The former Union soldier, whose army jacket lies in the right corner, is at work cutting wheat. The scythe brings to mind the Grim Reaper, a symbol of death, perhaps a reference not only to war casualties, but also Lincoln's assassination. But the bountiful field suggests national regeneration. Some of the more than 200,000 victorious soldiers who paraded in Washington on May 23rd and 24th in 1865 in the Grand Review of the Union Armies. In the background stands the Capitol, its dome unfinished when the war began, now complete.